I just want to kick off firstly with just a question about your motivation for writing this book, really, and how it builds on your previous work.
Well, actually, the book called The Gendered Brain, which was really about trying to debunk the myth of the male brain and the female brain, one of the consequences was that there was a backlash. A variety of very rude things were said, including being named a sex difference denier and a feminazi, range of things like that. I won't go into the rest of them, along with other writers like Cordelia Fine and Daphne Joel, and saying people like you are undermining essential sex difference research because you're getting people scared of doing sex difference research because you're accusing them of being sexist and saying that there are differences between male and female brains when there aren't, etc. But what about those brain-based conditions where we know there are in inverted commas, there are sex differences in prevalence? So, for example, many more women than men have Alzheimer's disease, and therefore it's essential that we do sex differences research to work out why this is happening. And there are many other conditions where there are more males than females, and top of the list was always autism, as well as Parkinson's disease. And then finger pointing at me, and you, as an autism researcher, because that was my day job effectively, should be ashamed of yourself because you're undermining this essential sex difference research into finding out why more men, boys and girls have autism, more men than women diagnosed with autism, etc. So slightly defensively, I thought, well, I really do need to have a look at this. I am an autism researcher. I'm not somebody who actually, bizarrely, we might come to later, researches sex differences in autism, but maybe I should be. And so I'll really have a look at what the story is. And maybe the critical analysis I've done of neurotypical work into neurotypical males and female differences pointed out where the bias was, etc. Maybe the same is true in the world of autism research. Or maybe it isn't true in autism research. Maybe autism as a condition is something where sex differences are much more common, where we can say these do have the sex of the individual has a determining factor, bearing in mind there were theories like the extreme male brain, which we may come back to. And so I started to say, okay, I'll have a look at this. And at the same time, somebody said, maybe you could write another book about that. And you think, oh, yes, the other one was such fun to write. This will be good to write another one. Anyway, when I started, I thought, right, first of all, I'll have a look at the kind of work that I've been doing on the social brain, which must be a key aspect of autism because of its relationship with difficulties with social behavior. And I'll look at the sex difference research. And that was really the motivation for the book, because when I started to look at the sex differences research that I was accused of undermining, there wasn't any, because all of the research was only being done on men, on male participants. 30 years of brain imaging research. I did a survey, and there was nothing in academia. So I actually had to sort of step out of writing the book, go into academia, write the review to prove this had happened, to say that for 30 years, we've been testing autistic participants. We've been drawing up models about, what it is that makes the world difficult. And we've been talking about, the model of autism is. But nobody has noticed or even claimed or even commented that you're only testing males. So you can only draw conclusions about a particular part of the population. So I thought this is going to be a really short book. So maybe I should, actually go back and find out why this has happened. And I already knew, as I'm sure all of you do, that if you were, stopped in the street and give us the top 5 words that summarize autism, male would come in there pretty early on. It was a male problem, helped by the media, Rain Man, etc., Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes, Big Bang Theory, all of those kind of things. So we all had a picture of, it's a male problem. So you think, well, maybe that's fair enough, but surely we need to know why it's a male problem, and we can only know why it's a male problem if actually we look at females as well. So I knew there was this kind of bias. But then I started looking at, the first chapter of the book I was told to write, let's just write a chapter on what is autism. And you immediately think, well, that's going to be a really long book because, we've been looking at it for 80, maybe more than that. We should have been, come back to that, years. And the whole concept has changed. Somebody who was looking at autism in the 1940s, late 40s, 50s, would not recognize the diagnostic schedule that we now have in 2013. So it's changed hugely. So I eventually kind of looked at how it had changed, where this idea that it was male came from, because the people most often talked about as the fathers of autism, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger. Well, Leo Kanner never really drew attention initially to the idea that it was a male problem. He had 8 boys and 3 girls in his cohort. Didn't comment on whether or not it was different in boys and girls. Hans Asperger he only had 4 boys in his kind of seminal paper, but he'd been looking at lots of other people. And he did actually talk about extreme male intelligence, and he did claim never to have seen a fully autistic girl in his career. History tells a different story, but that may be a whole different issue that we might touch on later. Anyway, so eventually it turned out that people were starting to count the cases of autism, and there did seem to be more boys than girls. So there were some girls diagnosed, but they were mainly boys. The picture of autism was emerging. So if you're looking at sex differences in the world, there's a long list of the go-to list of males are like this, long list of what they're like, the whole kind of Mars-Venus thing, men are from Mars, and a whole list for women are like this, they're, nurturant, whatever, etc., women are from Venus. If you look in the autism, descriptions of autism, there's autism in boys, and there's a long description of their social difficulties and their repetitive behaviors and unusual interests. Autistic girls, not so much. So there was a kind of blank. There was a template, which is what autism looked like in boys. Girls were almost not so much. So there was a little bit autistic. They didn't have such difficulties with social interaction. They didn't show so many unusual interests, etc. So I realized there was a big gap in even knowing what autism looked like in girls. And then I started to read waves of personal testimonies from late diagnosed women saying, I was diagnosed in my 30s, 40s, 50s, 72 was the oldest one I spoke to. And nobody, I'd struggled all my life, had all sorts of different diagnoses, all sorts of different medication, etc., until somebody at last said, I wonder if you might be autistic. They had an assessment. All of a sudden, my life made sense. So there were a large number of women who were describing in detail what their life had been like before they were diagnosed, what the diagnosis meant to them, etc. So these weren't kind of scientific reports, but they were immensely moving, immensely detailed. They were answering the question that we scientists should really have been asking: what is it like to be you? Anyway, so yes, the motivation was partly defensive and then intrigued, and then actually got quite angry when you read about some of the stories that these individuals were saying. And I got quite moved because I was talking to a whole age range, and it was the little girls in primary school who described their day. And I thought, these children need to be recognized, they need help. And being dismissed and saying, you're a girl, or she's a girl, as the parents wonder if there's a problem. She's just shy. And the teacher's saying, well, she's very good. She stands in the corner, doesn't talk to anybody, no trouble at all, actually does her homework very neatly, etc. But gets a bit anxious from time to time, but, we can cope with that kind of thing. Anyway, so a combination of all sorts of emotions and intrigue and detective work.
When I was diagnosed as autistic, when I was 28, about 5 years ago, there was a narrative about not really investigating and thinking too much about why my brain is the way it is, and kind of investigating and looking at the genetics side and the kind of neurobiological side of autistic brains. And in our discussion, we talked about we should be looking at biology, but not necessarily pathologizing autism. So I wanted to kind of ask you about what are the actual benefits of looking at our neurology and the brains of autistic people.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously I always find it quite surprising when people say, why do we need to know about the brain? You think, good Lord, either my whole career has been slightly wasted. Yeah. But I think there is a kind of pathological implication. I think people have a fixed idea that if something's biological, that's a bad thing. You know, we're getting attached to saying your brain is different, not realizing that in the context of what we brain images now know, that every brain is different from every other brain. So you're just part of the whole world's population, if you like. But there was an idea that it was pathological, genetics issue, unfortunate narrative around terms such as cure autism now, as though it was some kind of disease or illness. And of course, the biology aspect got hooked onto that.
Yeah,
so I think that's the downside. For me, the plus side is always, if somebody says, you know, this is what you're like or whatever, I want to know why. Why am I like this? Why do I find the world so confusing? Why do I watch my, you know, neurotypical child interact effortlessly on his first day in nursery school, which I talk about in the book, suddenly realizing that there's some kind of invisible social instinct, for example, it's not true of everybody, that I find really difficult. Why do I find it difficult? And I think for me, diagnosis is almost a key to understanding, of which how your brain works should be part of that. But I do know that that's not always the narrative or the message that comes across. And certainly in the previous book, there was this idea that, you know, if you were a female, then you had a female brain, because there was this kind of fixed, you had a body like this, so you had a brain like that, which meant you could, you know, your psychology, your behavior was like this, which meant this is what you could do in the world. So there was this kind of fixed, unchangeable image of why you needed to understand the brain.
Yeah, it's definitely changed my view, and I've become a lot more curious about my neurology now as the time has gone by, so I think it's really worthwhile. I want to ask you a bit about autism research and kind of in the past how it was conducted and kind of what was wrong with the recruitment methods in the beginning and participant recruitment, and what went wrong back then in terms of studying autistic
you mean
people.
Brain imaging research in particular, or research in
research in general? Yeah.
Well, I think the whole issue of it being a male problem it's what I call the male spotlight problem. And the image I use is, Noam Chomsky talked about science is a bit like the drunk who's looking for his keys under the lamppost, even though he lost them on the other side of the road, because that's where the light is. And I think that's exactly what was happening in science. People thought, oh, autism is a boy thing, because the early prevalence statistics by the 1960s and 70s were reporting much higher incidence in boys than girls. There were girls. There was a kind of 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. Once the sort of DSM-3 and 4 and Asperger's syndrome came in, there were reports of ratios as high as 15 to 1. So there was never an understanding that girls didn't get autism. But of course, those girls who were diagnosed with autism were being matched against a male template. So the girls who were most like boys in their behavior were the ones who were getting diagnosed. So there was this kind of fixed picture of what it was like. And of course, there were fewer differences between them because they were being matched against a sort of fixed template. So I think the problem with research was, and I would say more to do with brain imaging, certainly that went wrong because of the kind of practicalities. Early research was actually looking at sort of behavioral characteristics, but the behaviors they were looking at were the characteristics of boys. And because there were fewer girls, because of this belief, and we'll come back to the kind of barriers that there are for girls, for anybody to even acknowledge that girls get autism, let alone get referred, let alone get assessed, there were just many more boys about. And because there was this kind of early simplistic statistics, if you couldn't get enough girls to do a sex difference comparison, either you just didn't recruit girls because they just made the data messy, or you did recruit girls, but you then factor them out with your statistical analysis. So I think that's where it went wrong. They had a clear picture of what it was like, so that's what you tested. When you get to brain imaging, it's even more difficult because recruiting for brain imaging studies, as you can imagine, quite a lot of people like to do it, but then when they realize what it involves, they're not that keen. So you're trying to get large numbers of people to come and sit in your brain scanner and do various studies. If you then add a clinical component to that and say, actually, we want autistic individuals, you then have the same problem. You go to a pool which is full of people who've been diagnosed with autism, most of whom are male. So then again, you do the same thing. Do you take the females and there's only 1 or 2? Do you mean Do you think that might mean that makes the data more messy, more variable, so we won't recruit females? So all of that is why she says, slightly defensively, because I wasn't looking at sex differences, I was mainly testing males, I have to confess, is because, you know, it was a kind of pragmatic thing. And the other thing I would say is that lots of the big funding bodies have kind of got tied in with this whole diagnosis, psychiatric diagnosis, belief that, you know, maybe I should find out how many psychiatrists there are here today. Belief that psychiatrists are infallible, and if they say somebody is autistic, then they are autistic, or they're depressed, then they're depressed, etc. Not quite the true story. But anyway, so effectively, the funding bodies would say, well, if you're going to spend all of this money recruiting large numbers of children or looking at adults or doing brain imaging, we need to be sure that they're really autistic. And so they would insist on these so-called gold standard tests, the ADOS and the ADI, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, Autism Diagnostic Interview Schedule, which is, you know, lists of the kind of behaviors that you think are characteristic of autistic individuals. Do the children show those behaviors, or do parents report them, etc.? So there's a kind of built-in screening factor. If you're even, you know, sent for assessment, boys are 10 times more likely than girls to be referred for autism assessment, and that's recent statistics. Girls who are referred, boys are twice as likely to be identified as autistic than girls, even though they present with the same problems. So all of these barriers are blocking up the pipeline.
Yeah. Very complex. And I guess, you know, being a neuroscientist and science in general, you need to be quite stringent with your participants and data and trying to balance that, for sure. That's a methodological excuse. We should really also have been saying, you do realise we're only looking at males. Yeah. There may be another story, but we didn't, or we didn't for 30 years. We are now. Do you think there's types of autism research that maybe needs to be revised, like how people are currently conducting autism research now?
Yes. Well, it's happening, fortunately. It's really in the last decade or so. And in particular, what's happening is large-scale studies are being held, very well funded in the States, smaller scale studies in the UK, but also worldwide studies, particularly if you've got a heterogeneous population like autism. You know, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I'm sure you've heard that. So you need large numbers of participants. And so there were big data sets being put together, labs particularly across the States, but across the world, contributing to data sets that other people could interrogate. So you're getting thousands of people. Early on, the thousands of people were 80%, 85% of them were male. Here we go again. But that's all changing. So there's a much greater openness to the idea that, assuming we're still talking about autism, which is another question, there are females who are autistic. We need to find better ways of identifying them. We need to be more sensitive to their presence, to their existence even. And then you can say, okay, let's just, as a good start, replicate all the studies we did over the last 30 years, only with males, with females as well. And that is starting to produce some really interesting results. And that's sort of where I came in. And there are now, well, unfortunately, quite a lot of them being shut down by a certain president in a certain state. There are big funded organisations specifically looking for sex differences. So all of that's changed, but only in the last 10 years, maybe. Just about.
It's quite recent, isn't it? Because not only do we have to revise and replicate the past research, it's also now investigating like the actual lived experiences of autistic people as well, which actually is really important.
Talk to your participants.
Yes, exactly.
Very good idea. It's now called participatory research, and quite a lot of it is actually advised by autistic participants by saying, you know, these are the kind of questions you should be asking. These are how you should be interpreting what people are saying. So actually involving them in the research technique, which I think is really valuable. And so, you know, hopefully sunlit uplands of well-informed research are within reach.
I want to talk about masking now, just because I think it underpins your book. And I think the term is quite well known to some and it can be misinterpreted. So I kind of want to ask you to explain what the concept of masking is and kind of how it kind of gets in the way of autistic girls and women getting their diagnosis.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. Camouflaging or masking, just to briefly describe the terms, they sort of feel like the same thing, but they present slightly differently. Camouflaging is very much to do with trying to blend in so that nobody notices you're different. And so that's the kind of behavior where individual females in particular, not true of all females, and we perhaps come back to that, can be true of some males, but tends to be more true of females, are trying to hide the fact that they're different. From a very young age, 4 or 5, they've been called weird in class, they've been bullied in their playground, etc. And they desperately want to be part of the big social group they see in their playground, if we're talking about primary school, etc. So they try and hide the fact that they're different. So the way in which they hide, because they realize they're different, is actually to watch very carefully how people behave, how they interact, how the popular girls get to be popular. And they copy those activities, not just a kind of general idea of what they're like, slavishly work out how those movements, how to copy those movements. They write little social scripts for themselves, which they practice in front of the mirror. So desperately, they're trying to camouflage that they're different. Masking is the same kind of idea. You don't want people to see that either you're distressed or you don't understand what's going on. So you adopt a different persona. You may be the class clown, or you may be the super athlete, or the person who's always the lead in the school play, etc. But you're never actually yourself because you feel uncomfortable. You don't understand why yourself is so distressed, doesn't fit in with other people. So you mask. There's quite a few books on autism, particularly in women, which have titles like Behind the Mask or Dropping the Mask, etc. But all of it was to do with this group of individuals who didn't want anybody to know they were autistic. They wouldn't actually describe it like that. Way back in the 1980s, when the prevalence data was starting to come through, I think it was either Lorna Wing or Judith Gould, both of whom are big names in the mothers of autism, if you like. Kanner and Asperger being mistakenly referred to as the fathers of autism, but we'll come back to that. They said, I wonder why there aren't so many girls. And I think it was Lorna Wing who said, almost in passing, maybe the girls are just better at hiding the fact that they're autistic. So the idea of camouflaging has been around, but it was almost a kind of throwaway comment. And it wasn't really, I think, until these personal testimonies came out, when people were describing in detail how they camouflaged, what they actually did, how they were hiding their problems, that it became more of a focus for understanding autism, as opposed to the kind of questions that could have been asked. So why is this more common in girls than boys? Why is it camouflaging? And why are they doing it? If you're autistic, why should you care what other people think? Because the picture of autism was that you were a loner, lacked effective contact, didn't have any need to belong to other people, etc. So it's a bit of a paradox which never really materialized until much later. So camouflaging and masking was really to do with a sort of get out of jail card free for psychiatrists who could say, well, we didn't know they're autistic women because they were hiding, kind of thing. And then people started saying, but don't you think it's slightly unusual behavior? And they started looking at it and talking to them, what's it like to be you? And they realized this group of individuals who are referred to as the chameleons. So I have an idea that we have the Kanner type autism, which is much more to do with the characteristic stereotype of a loner who has particular focused interests, isn't really interested in other people, or doesn't understand how to interact with other people. And there's this other chameleon group who actually want to belong to groups of other people, and so they hide their difficulty. The key thing to remember, or to be aware of, is that actually you'd think, okay, that's a helpful strategy. That's a good way of getting through life without being picked on too much. But actually, most of them will say this isn't a solution. This is a survival strategy. And what people are saying is, my life as an autistic individual without an understanding of why I'm like this has been so painful that I will actually go through all of this exhausting, physically and mentally exhausting, day after day, presenting yourself as somebody different, hiding the fact that you were different, etc. And that's why you get, the characteristic autistic meltdowns of little girls who've been perfect at school. The only time they get into trouble is when they go home and they have these meltdowns. So that's an issue too. But it turns out that once people started looking at camouflaging and masking behavior, it appears to be very maladaptive because it's very positively correlated with high levels of depression and anxiety, suicidal ideation, etc. So it adds another layer to the why are they camouflaging? Why are they still camouflaging when it's so maladaptive? Which makes you realize how important whatever it is that's driven them to camouflage must be to make them put up with their lives as they are, without anybody saying, do you know what? I think there might be something called autism, which could actually help explain the difficulties you've had in these 30, 40, 50, even 60, 70 years you've been struggling. So you can drop the mask and say, I can be me.
What are the long-term effects then for autistic women and those diagnosed later in life from having to mask and camouflage for most of their lives?
Well, some of it is to do with identity. And there is a big issue about over-diagnosis at the moment, which we may get onto. One of the things, you ask yourself, what's a diagnosis for? And one of the very common themes in women, late diagnosed women, once they've been diagnosed, is that a feeling of relief, a feeling of, at last I found my tribe, is a common report or phrase in those sort of words, that you feel that I now understand why life has been so difficult. So usually relief, I found my tribe, and then regret and grief, how different my life might have been if somebody had spotted at age 6, 7, 8 that I was struggling and thinking it might be this thing called autism, which could then have sent my life on a different track. I mean, that may be something we could talk about, whether or not you think that would be a good thing. Or again, the overdiagnosis thing is, give a child a label and the child will live that label for the rest of its life. But it looks like don't give the child a label and the rest of their life will be very difficult. I use the term label in inverted commas, by the way. I think that's the issue. And I think that's why the whole late diagnosis issue is really important.
I agree. It's sense making, isn't it? It's past the actual diagnosis to just trying to make sense of our lives.
Yes. And very often in the context for late diagnosed women, very often it's been in the context of they have a child, the child is autistic, diagnosed as autistic, and they go to the clinician describes what autism is and what it's like and what it'll mean for this child. And the mother will say, but that's me, I've always been like that. And they say, oh, maybe you're autistic. So it takes, something like that for somebody, the curtain or the invisibility cloak, I call it, to be whipped away and say, right, this is what's been going on.
And isn't it the same for other kind of diagnoses? So it's also quite common for late diagnosed autistic women to be diagnosed with a mental health condition before they're autistic as well. Is that also a common thing?
I think that is a very common thing, particularly around adolescence. There's a chapter in the book called The Perfect Storm, because if you're adolescent and your brain's busy reorganizing itself, you're female, and there's certain expectations which are different from if you're male, and you're autistic, but maybe haven't been identified, that is the perfect storm. And that's the point at which girls who've managed to fly beneath the radar up till 13, 12, 13, 14 maybe, coincides, unfortunately, in the Western world with going from a sort of slightly safer, smaller, more predictable primary school to a hugely complex secondary school, new areas, new people, new teachers, a whole new different system. That's when their carefully constructed scaffolding starts to break down and it's no longer fit for purpose. And they start really showing symptoms of distress and symptoms of atypical behavior, very often which present themselves in ways which allows a clinician to reach for a diagnostic label. Eating disorders, very common. A diagnostician will think, girl, disordered eating, anorexia. And many, many cases, in one particular study that I interrogated, I think there was something like 18 or 19 autistic women who it turned out had been diagnosed with anorexia first. So that's what the clinician saw. Girl, anorexia. Similarly, self-harm, is another area. So I think that's the point at which things become difficult. And even now, possibly because there's a big lag behind, let's have a look at what happens at the menopause. Yes. And that looks like that's something which is another trigger area, whole quantum leap, as you like, with respect to how your autism is interacting with your body and your brain and the changes happening there. So I think that's an issue. And one family I spoke with, the girl, no trouble at all, perfect, etc. Primary school, went to secondary school, complete meltdown within the first term, eating disorders, eventually sent to the anorexic clinic, who sent her straight back and said, she's not anorexic, she's autistic. She then had to wait 4 years to get an autism assessment. It's what somebody sees. I mean, we love to think that, as scientists, as clinicians, we're terribly objective. We have nice, helpful checklists, diagnostic and statistical manual like that. We're still biased. We still think, must be anorexia because it's a girl, or can't be autism because it's a girl.
And only looking at, I guess, the external presentations and the behaviour and...
That's right. Yes, absolutely. And if the external presentation is in your checklist of what it looks like in boys, then you won't find it
exactly.
in girls.
So gender normativity as well, because obviously I think that the reason why women and girls have been misdiagnosed or not seen is partly to do with kind of gender expectations and presentation. So I wanted to ask about kind of what role does, I guess, socialization and like gender normativity play in the kind of miss or underdiagnosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, it was part of the earlier explanations for missing girls. There's a great phrase, we raise our boys to be brave and our girls to be perfect. And girls are more intensively socialized from a very early age, on average. So they're encouraged to be good, not to make a fuss, to make friends, to be quiet. If there was anything that was troubling them, then they should internalize it. They shouldn't, kick the filing cabinets or shout at the teacher or throw books across the room or whatever. So the idea was that, again, was that the presentation in girls was different. And that's why they were missed, because boys were much more likely to be playing up and externalizing. So there was a kind of socialization explanation that girls internalized their difficulties, and that's why they were camouflaging. But I think that's only part of the story. I think particularly when you look at some of the brain imaging studies that are being done now, it's more than just if you took all of that away from the girls, would they look like the boys? I think that's the thing. They're hiding the fact that they've got the same symptoms. I don't think they're hiding the fact that they've got the same symptoms. They're hiding the fact that they're distressed. But when you start to look at why they're hiding, I think they're hiding something different. And this comes back to the camouflaging. Why, as an autistic individual who by definition doesn't really mind what other people think about you or want to belong to groups.
Sometimes.
Sorry, I shouldn't. I mean, I'm actually characterizing it from the traditional view. Why is nobody saying this is what Kanner said? He talked about aloofness. Aloof is a term that's used quite a lot. And I think that's the image which, and the term autism, of course, means kind of self-absorbed, etc. So yes, sorry, you're absolutely right, and I think that illustrates what's wrong with the definition of autism. Exactly. But I think it's not just the girls aren't just flying beneath the radar, hiding in plain sight, whatever metaphor you want to use. I think there's something different going on in this group of autistic individuals, most of whom are female, she says carefully, because there are males like that as well.
Yeah. So what are the brain imaging research showing then that's kind of different to what other types of research is? I'm saving it.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, because I was focusing on the social brain, because the brain has evolved to make us social. It's evolved to make sure we have the right kind of knowledge, to understand other people as well as ourselves. It does involve our own identity, but understanding other people's emotions, their facial expressions, etc. So we have kind of social knowledge store. We have a sort of very primitive coding store, which is the sort of emotional center, which is coding a social experience or social knowledge is a good thing. Make sure if you want to belong, to find your in-group, make sure you know what they're like. That was a good thing to happen. If somebody's got a facial expression like that, that means they're sad. So you've got a coding system, but you've also got a behavioural control system, which is where actually I've done most of my work, where if you're having a negative social experience, a particular part of the brain is activated. If you're having a positive social experience, a different part of the brain is activated. And the negative part of the brain that's activated is very, very similar to the part of the brain that's activated when you experience real, genuine physical pain. So negative social experiences are very powerful drivers of human behaviour. And I think that's something that we're now starting to understand. The original men-only work, looking at the social brain in brain imaging, reported that the sort of social reward system, the activation of the social knowledge centres, the approach avoid type, go, no-go type behavioural control was all muted in the participants they were looking at. So they were saying, we've got this traditional explanation of autism as being sort of aloof and not that much interested in social behaviour. Hey, look how it's mirrored in these research that we're doing, which shows that there's less activity, less connections in this part of the brain. Aha, we come to the females and they replicate the studies and they starting to find the complete opposite. The most emotional motivation areas are much more powerfully activated by socially negative experiences. The social knowledge or self-monitoring parts of the brain are also activated more powerfully in female participants, use the term advisedly, on average, which of course fits in with the newer picture we have of this camouflaging, where you're constantly monitoring yourself, making sure that you're doing what other people are doing, that you're seeing what's happening, how are people responding to this. So we're starting to get brain imaging work, which is tying in nicely with this newer model. Luckily, because otherwise, if you've got a psychologist who came up with this wonderful model and a brain imager said, no, that's not what's happening in the social brain. So yes, it does look like something different is happening. Bearing in mind that most of the people you look at in brain imaging studies at the moment are adults. So they have lived their life up to that point. No, even if they're teenagers, they've lived their life as camouflagers, or they've lived their life as loners or whatever. And what you're looking at is that experience, because come back to the original book, the sort of strap line was a gendered world makes a gendered brain. If the world that you're working in or interacting with, you interact with it in different ways, it'll change your brain. So we may be looking at the consequences of camouflaging behaviour rather than the causes.
I was very fascinated in the qualitative side of autism research, where it's looking at the experiences and just taking masking as a concept and just understanding it as a concept. But then I think understanding it from a kind of brain imaging kind of point of view and seeing the evidence supports it more, adds a bit of weight to it.
Well, one of the questions, because the people I interviewed, I wanted it as open-ended as possible. So I said, if you had an hour with a brain imager like me, what would you ask me to explain about your autism? And one of the questions, there was a great question, what makes autistic brains autistic? And you think, ooh, it's another 200 years of research. But somebody was saying, why do I try and hide? And they found it gratifyingly quite interesting when I explained it in brain terms. I said, and I said also, because a lot of it's to do with the reward system. Now your brain works like that. It could be that you could not necessarily ruminate obsessively about the mistakes you made. You could also be a bit self-compassionate, if you like. And that will actually also change how your brain then copes with things in the future.
I think we talked about it before, but knowledge is power. Having, as autistic people, having that scientific knowledge for why our brain is the way it is, I think is quite empowering.
Yes, and there's Damien Milton is a psychologist who talks about the double empathy problem in autism, where autistic people find it very difficult to understand how neurotypicals negotiate the world and desperately trying to see if they could do that. From the other side of the looking glass, which is another concept I've used, the neurotypical world doesn't understand enough about how differently autistic people experience the world. So if we could come together on that with that knowledge, as you said, this is why they find change so appallingly difficult. They are suffering real pain if some routine is changed. As you grow older, you might develop strategies to disguise that, but you're still feeling the pain. And if you're, a small child, then you might have a meltdown, etc. So understanding what's going on and then knowing how to respond to it, I think that's important. So it should inform understanding. I mean, we've just had Autism Acceptance Month. So accepting what's happening, I think hopefully that would inform it.
Do you think the two will reconcile? So like neurotypicals understanding autistic people and autistic people understanding neurotypicals?
I think raising the awareness, the fact that, it might seem we now have autism-friendly theatre performances, etc. So there is an understanding that the world can make accommodations. I'm slightly worried about this whole overdiagnosis narrative and the tone of it that's going on at the moment, because it's almost like a pushback saying they're not really autistic, or they, sick note from life is one of the terms that I have come across. One would love to think that we're riding a wave of mutual understanding. I suspect not. Yes. But let's be optimistic.
Is there a way that neuroimaging can investigate that more than the kind of double empathy? It's a theory.
You could use, the biology explanation has two sides. First of all, is it pathologizing? Is it, making people think this is disease or illness? But if you could say, actually, I could show you how the brain of an autistic individual responds to an overbright light or something. So sometimes people, they find brain imaging, the pictures anyway, quite interesting. So that might help. So you could actually say, this is just this person's brain responds differently, and it'll make them do this. And if we could change the external trigger, then they won't do that. Yeah. So you could use it that way. So you could use it as knowledge without pathologizing it.
Yeah, I'm actually curious as well, kind of what brought you into this field of research?
It was the brain. For some reason, I've always had a fascination about the brain. There are family rumours that I used to trepan my teddy bears to see if they had brains. I'm sure that's just a family story. I don't know if I knew what the brain was, but it somehow it became embedded very early on in something I wanted to study. I was going to go to medical school as a way of studying the brain, but for various reasons got diverted into psychology, but chose psychology courses, which were much more neuroscience-based, because when I did psychology a long time ago, there were still sort of behaviourist type courses or courses which didn't look at the brain. So I very carefully chose ones that did the brain. And then when I went on to do research, I was doing research into schizophrenia. So I was, right at the extreme, if you like. I wanted to see what the brain was doing that made people have these very unusual experiences. We're not talking about general behaviour, hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, etc. So my PhD was actually looking at the brain differences between paranoid and non-paranoid schizophrenics. Yeah, so I think it was just, but I was always interested in not the brain as an object, but the brain as a mechanism which made people do things or not do things. And then once I started researching in my own right and setting up my own lab, I was interested in what made brains different. Anatomically, brains on the surface do look identical. Some are bigger, some are smaller. There can be problems with some of them. Once you get into them, there are many more differences. But a lot of the early research was looking for the language centers in the brain, and could we tell the difference between sentence structure, semantics, and syntactics? But I was much more interested in what made people different, made different choices, had different skills. I was very interested in visuospatial processing, partly because I'm such an appalling. I don't think I have a hippocampus, which if you want to look that up at some point, you'll realise how bad my visuospatial processing. So I think, as with most things you study, the thing you're worst at.
What do you hope will change as a result of writing your book? What would you be most excited to see change?
I think some change is already happening in that just the awareness that girls can be autistic too. I'd very much like it to be in the early years. So I'd like it embedded in teacher training because I think they are the people who are best suited probably early on to pick something up. I think the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 needs a version 6, which may go back to types of autism, which is a debate that people are having, because part of the thing we very barely touched on is you don't like to call the other end of the spectrum, but there is profoundly, and I use the term impaired, individuals who will need support all of their lives, who may be non-verbal, self-injurious, etc. So that needs to be borne in mind. Whether or not we continue to call it autism is, I think, a debate that should be had. And it intersects with the whole diagnosis issue about what do these terms actually mean? Is it telling you anything useful? And I think the term autism has got so inclusive that it's actually not any good for researchers. I mean, geneticists, for example, whether or not you think there should be genetics research into autism, it is the most inheritable condition. So that may be interesting to see where this comes from. We're up to 800 implicated genes, etc. But how can you research into a condition which is so broadly defined, particularly geneticists who, want to find, a particular type of perception or sensory response, etc. So I think awareness hopefully will be the thing. Self-awareness too, so that it's difficult obviously for younger children, but for girls and women are struggling now, hopefully they found their voice and their voices will no longer be unheard.
I'm autistic and I can relate to a lot of what you're saying through my life experience. I wondering, based on all the research, especially in females, why it's so easy to try and mask loads of stuff, but then also when you're in real big social predicaments, what part of the brain finds it so difficult to just try and be, when you try and initiate conversation, but then you can't initiate conversation, because I know it's something I've always struggled with.
Yes, indeed. And I think maybe lots of people can relate to that. What actually happens is, for some reason, we've evolved this almost invisible social instinct. Children are hopefully given sort of guidelines about how to behave and not to shout, interrupt, or talk to other people. So they kind of pick up basic rules of conversational exchange. But gradually, as time goes on, it becomes almost automatic. And I tell a story in the book about a late diagnosed autistic woman whose first child, a boy, was severely autistic, and whose second child, also a boy, was neurotypical. And she took him to nursery, very anxious about how he was going to cope, and was just amazed about how he just plunged into this melee of toddlers and seemed to know exactly what he was supposed to be doing and got involved in games, etc. So there's almost as though there's an invisible human instinct for social exchange, which, for whatever reason, because of the way in which the autistic brain is connected, that isn't available as automatically. And I think that's the difficulty that autistic people have. Because it's automatic for other people, they don't understand that it's not automatic for everybody. So they find it quite difficult if somebody, interrupts or doesn't seem to understand the give and take of conversation. And certainly the business about initiating a conversation, that was the kind of things that people mentioned to me a lot about practicing opening gambits. So they'd go to a social event and they'd have a list of how they would interact with somebody, how they would do that, what they would ask them. And very often it would be the same thing. And sometimes that was how, with younger girls, when clinicians hadn't spotted them, they realised that these children were following, quite young children, were following a script, because the next time they saw them, having thought, because their list says, how do they interact? Do they respond nicely when I say hello to them, etc. Next time they see them, they realise they're getting exactly the same answers. So I think that's what happens, and I think that's a strategy which can work, but sometimes it's, you're surrounded by people who don't seem to have to have something written on their arm to what shall I ask or what shall I say first kind of thing. metaphorically, or maybe really. One person I knew had a list of questions on her inside arm so that she could work through them to survive a social situation. So yeah, it's hard, unfortunately. Thank you. Great question.
I really like what you're talking about in terms of the psychological and emotional toll of masking, and how people get diagnosed with all sorts of psychiatric conditions as a consequence of masking. And I wonder if we're going to think as well, not just the mental toll that masking may have, but also about the physical toll and how they interact. And then as a bonus, if you're in a body that has an unstable sense of where you are, do you think that will have an effect on the autistic brain?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think the physical toll and the exhaustion is what is reported, long-term fatigue, and there's this kind of shutdown, which happens sometimes in autistic individuals when everything stops. They're almost comatose. They don't respond to the sound of their name. Their body has just said enough. So I think that's the physical aspect. Our brains are constantly making guesses, making predictions about how we should be dealing with the information. And it's not an exact science for the brain, bizarrely. It's a kind of, this will good enough. So it'll says when you hear this particular sound or see that particular sight, or even in a social situation, it generates a kind of good enough pattern of behavior and say, if this happens, this is carry on. The autistic brain, and this is really the work that I was doing, seems to lack that ability to make the world predictable. And that can be really quite fundamental. What looks to us, if we turn our heads, our brain will be telling us you're turning your head, and therefore that's why you've got a different view of the world. If you haven't got a very good way of doing that, you might think, oh, the world's starting to spin around, because you're not getting the feedback that your head is moving, if you like. And so you get a very quite frightening perception. There was one child who was terrified of the wallpaper in her nursery, and it was covered in lots and lots of little teddy bears. And when she moved her head, she thought the teddy bears were moving because the brain wasn't giving her the right feedback that actually it's your head moving, the teddy bears are staying where they were. So that's the sort of example of how your body and how the brain drives your senses, for example. So that would be feedback where your body is in space. It can be just very tiny, but it can be enough to make the world quite scary, particularly if you're a small child. So I think, the idea of not being very good at knowing where your body is in space, and dyspraxia, clumsiness, is a common characteristic of autism as well. So I think that's an interesting aspect. An odd gait as well, toe walking and things. So it's not, it's not just the brain, it's all about the brain, but it's not just about patterns of behaviour, it's also about motor control, etc.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, is being autistic or having autism a purely human thing, or has it ever been seen in apes? Have you ever done brain imaging on apes, and is it similar?
I mean, interestingly, there's a theory called the theory of mind, which is suggested to be uniquely human in that not only do we understand what we're thinking, we're pretty good at understanding what other people are thinking, and we pick up cues, facial expression, etc. And there has been a debate in neuroscience and psychology about are humans the only people who have a theory of mind. And the only way you can tell it is if somebody anticipates somebody's next movement. For example, that's just one example, facial expressions and things like that. So there is a view that if you look at some patterns of animal behavior, they're clearly making predictions about, where their prey is going to be next, for example. But the idea of autism originally, traditionally, was to do with having or not having the need to belong to a herd, if you like. Now, in animals, non-human animals, that's not a very adaptive response, because you pretty soon get caught by the lion or whatever if you're an antelope. I don't know what happens if you're a lion, but anyway, so that you don't tend to get loner animals because the herd instinct is and their environment is such that it survives. And in fact, animals who are on their own, and this is a problem with zoos and things like that when they first got those, was that they needed contact with other people like them.
I don't know much about this, but I'm aware that there's a researcher in Cambridge who has this idea about fetal testosterone and autism. I wondered what you thought about this. Do you think that there's any credit to this?
The extreme male brain, yes. Well, that in a way is a really interesting case study of how an unchallenged belief formed a whole development of a whole theory, a whole research program, and a characterization of a condition, the empathizing, systemizing. Are people familiar with the extreme male brain? Simon Baron-Cohen? The idea was that he took, and it was particularly him, he was the one who talked about theory of mind. So his work on autism, I find really interesting when he's talking about the balance between finding rules and being a systemizer, or understanding emotions and being an empathizer. So that's quite interesting. But for some reason, he then got diverted into sex differences and accepted that mostly autistic people were male. He also took, unchallenged, was that the characteristic of being autistic was an obsession with rules and patterns and systems, etc. He also accepted the idea that there was a male brain. So he had an idea that a male had a brain which drove their behavior to seek rules and patterns, etc. So he then applied that to autism and said autism is very much about that kind of behavior. Autism's individuals are mainly male, so they must have an extreme male brain. So that, I don't think I had to have a legal read for my book for that. Anyway, be careful what we say. Can we have Chatham House rules here anyway? Yeah, so it was a misconceived theory, became very powerful. It was very unpopular in the autism community because of the implications for what autism was and what it wasn't. He has backtracked on that quite significantly, and his new book, The Pattern Seekers, barely mentions sex differences at all. But the idea was it was due to testosterone. Your brain became male because after 6 weeks after conception approximately, suddenly a huge wash of testosterone if you were genetically male, and that organized the brain to be the brain of a male, which was a brain which was good at visuospatial processing and loved rules and all of that kind of stuff. And he's done a lot of work on fetal testosterone, proving an association between variations, higher levels than normal of testosterone in individuals who later were diagnosed with autism. Methodologically, that work is very unsound, but it has left a long shadow in the research community as well as in the kind of public consciousness of what autism is. He claims actually that it's got a bad press because people didn't understand what he was talking about. But he did say, opening lines, the female brain is hardwired, which is another, negative concept quite possibly, for empathy. The male brain is hardwired for systemizing. So clear statement, there was a female brain or a male brain, it's hardwired, two different types of behavior. Later on in the book, he says, of course, you don't actually have to be a male to have a male brain. At which point you think, so why did you call it a male brain? Anyway, so language matters.
Autism has got lots of friends, hasn't it? ADHD, OCD, dyspraxia, DLD. Like, how can you, when you look at a brain, and can you just look at an autistic brain, or do you ever really know if there's other things going on?
Yes, I would agree. There's all sorts of other terms. We've got autism and ADHD very often since DSM-5, I think, both can be diagnosed. It used to be you could either have one or the other. You couldn't have both. Now you can have both, which I think possibly says more about what diagnosis is than what the conditions are. But perhaps that's another story. And then now there's ADHD, of course, as well, which is another condition emerging. The dyspraxia could be related to the fact that autism isn't just about behavior, it's also about motor and sensory aspects as well. No, you can't look at a brain and say this is an autistic brain, because in a way that's almost what people are thinking in psychiatry. Because if you think about it in psychiatry, if a condition is found to have a biological cause, it's no longer a psychiatric condition. There was a condition called Rett syndrome, which was part of the autism diagnosis, much more common in girls. It was then found the genetic causes of Rett syndrome So it's no longer part of a psychiatric diagnosis. It is a recognisable syndrome with a biomarker, genetic biomarker. It's a bit like looking, people say, if I gave you a brain, could you tell if it was a brain from a man or a brain from a woman? Or if I gave you a brain scan, would you be able to tell? And the answer is no, because you need to know the context. And certainly with autism, certainly the work we were looking at, we're starting to tell this business about predictability. We could see how information was being processed in brains and how it was different in neurotypical brains from autistic brains. So if I saw a brain with this particular pattern of activity that we were looking at, I'd say it is more likely that the owner of that brain was autistic. That's as far as I would dare go. I used to work with dyslexia, for example, and parents would say, oh, can you give me a brain image so I can take it to the school or the teacher or the whatever and say, there you are, he's dyslexic. And no, I couldn't, and wouldn't actually, because you couldn't do that. You could say, well, this child is having difficulty with reading because X, Y, and Z, but there is no bit of the brain which, oh, look, that's the dyslexia area, or the reading area is missing or something. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. Well, perhaps it's just as well.
I wonder if you could tell us something about your ideas on overdiagnosis, and connected with that, how far is a diagnosis of autism advantageous, and can it be disadvantageous?
To the last two questions, yes and yes. Certainly the stories I was hearing from the women I was interviewing was that the autism diagnosis was advantageous because, in quotes, at last my life made sense, or, an understanding. Identity is a key issue in psychiatric diagnosis. There is an argument in medical diagnosis that perhaps, you can get an illness identity, which is not a good thing because everything that happens to you, you then say is because of my illness, sort of thing. I think psychiatric diagnosis is different, and I think identity is important. But I also think, I think I said before, diagnosis is a key to understanding. So if a diagnosis is done properly, and I think that's really where the overdiagnosis narrative falls short, then the person who receives the diagnosis should understand what it means. If it's, the probability of getting a particular kind of cancer, or the probability of, so you really educate the person as to what this means, then I think that is what a diagnosis should be. I think the overdiagnosis, I don't know where the narrative and the tone of that discussion is very unfortunate. And you kind of think that somebody just gets the autism diagnosis online or something. I think the waiting lists are, well, on average, there's areas in the UK which are waiting five years for an autism diagnosis for children. I mean, if you think the difference between a child at age 5 and a child at age 10 and what help they should have had in those 5 years is really important. But I think I don't understand where this, well, I do understand where this narrative has come from. It's their Skyvers, we didn't have any of this autism malarkey when I was growing up kind of tone, which is the idea of, as I said, a sick note from life. People are saying that this kind of diagnosis is being used as an excuse. And I really don't think that's the case. I think the people saying that don't really understand what a diagnosis is. I mean, autism diagnosis, you have levels of severity. These gold standard tests, gold standard or not, just take days to administer, and the reports are 15 pages long or something.
More than that.
More than that. Okay. So, it's not a quick fix, which people seem to think it is.
You say that every brain is different, and then you say there's a huge variety.
Yeah. Well, I think, in fact, there's the review I wrote about the lack of brain imaging in women, called Differently Different, because I think what has happened is that there are differences, and maybe, and this might be a good thing for AI in the future, we could take all of these data, we could take behavioral profiles, we could take brain imaging profiles, genetics, endocrinology, etc., huge amount of data, and get the AI models to interrogate those data and find patterns which weren't tied to whether you're male, female, autistic, non-autistic, etc., and say, are those patterns associated with some kind of distress or success or whatever? And so we may be able to use that better. in the future. I think we've become victims of labeling stuff and assuming those labels told us everything we needed to know, and I think that's not the case.